if the job of a medieval king is simple, not easy, but simple, you have to provide justice at home and be good at fighting mainly the French. Henry V was excellent at both of those jobs. In some senses, Henry V is certainly at the root of the Wars of the Roses, which ensue because of the disastrous trouble Henry VI, his regents, and then himself have with managing the scale of his father's achievement. But it's not enough for that to be true to say that he should never have tried. If he hadn't tried, things would have been much worse. He never quits. He never stops. And this injunction on his tomb, this inscription, although not from him, is still so suitable. Flee idleness. That's him. Flee idleness. Never stop.
Hello. On October the 25th, 1415, Henry V led the English army onto the field of Agincourt. There he defeated the flower of French chivalry to win perhaps the finest victory of the medieval period, made famous by Shakespeare's play. But who was Henry V? Brilliant general, skilled politician, or simply a warmonger? And is there a figure from the past that he most resembles? Dan Jones, the author of a new biography of Henry, joins to answer these and many more questions as we try to get to the bottom of Henry V. Plenty more history is on the way, including espionage during World War II, the SAS in Italy, the Roman poet Ovid, and a special two-parter as the anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar approaches. If you can, please do give a kind rating on either Spotify or Apple, and please do share with friends and family. That would be wonderful. But until then, I'll hand you over to me talking with Dan Jones on Henry V. Dan, welcome to the podcast. Great pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
No, thank you. It's great to be talking to you.
And talking about your new book, Henry V, The Astonishing Rise of England's Greatest Warrior King. I'm very pleased you wrote this because I was a early devotee of yours, I think the Plantagenets and then the Hollow Crown. And as you write in your introduction, this is very much not a third in a trilogy, but a sort of a tile to complete the nice mosaic or something. This was always a plan, was it, Henry V?
Well, I wouldn't say it was so much a plan as I wrote The Plantagenets, and that was published in 2012, 2013 in the UK and US. Straight after that, I wrote The Wars of the Roses. Now, the structure of those two books was such that The Plantagenets just naturally came to an end in 1399. Thematically, that was the place where that book had to end, with the deposition of Richard II. And then the structure of the Wars of the Roses book, the Hollow Crown, the Wars of the Roses, as it was variously called, worked best by starting in 1420 with the marriage of Henry V and Catherine de Valois, because Catherine de Valois would eventually go on to be the sort of part of the origin story of the Tudors, which was where the Wars of the Roses story was going to end. So that left a 21-year gap, which was sort of a Henry IV, Henry V shaped hole. And I realized that at some point I would want to, maybe even have to, plug that gap if I was to feel satisfied with my sort of work chronicling the whole of the dynastic history of the English later Middle Ages, the Plantagenet dynasty. So it was always on the cards to that extent. I'd always been particularly fascinated by Henry V, and in a way it was nice to leave him out of those two first books in the main, because he certainly had, and to a lesser extent has, the reputation of being the greatest of all the medieval kings of England. He was the one who did the job about as perfectly as it was possible to do the job. And I think that the best and most interesting subjects for biography, of political biography, are those who do a job very well and those who do a job very badly. And so Henry V felt like this would be a great way to get into the bones of what was the essence of being a medieval king. And because Henry V just seems to appear on the throne in 1413 and in 9 short years get it as right as anybody ever gets it. And so that was the kind of thinking for writing this particular book. And then, of course, I just had to wait for a time to do it. And I'd written two novels, two of a trilogy of novels, the Essex Dogs books one and two. And I wanted to write a work of non-fiction before I finished that trilogy. And so I just felt like the right time for me to write it as well. You know, I've written 14 books by this point, and I felt like I was going to come to this Henry V project ready to do it well and do it properly, because you only have, well, one thing I've learned, and it seems obvious, is you only get one shot at a topic as an author, and you don't want to come to a topic you're really enthusiastic about and not be ready as a writer to handle it.
And this is Henry V we're talking about. Amongst scholars today, what's the view on Henry V as you sort of enter into it and enter into writing the book?
Well, the long consensus on Henry V from pretty much his death until the mid late 20th century was, as I've sort of described, that this was the guy who's the acme of kingship. If the job of a medieval king is simple, not easy, but simple, you have to provide justice at home and be good at fighting mainly the French. Henry V was excellent at both of those jobs. In more recent years, some scholars have taken issue with Henry, particularly for decisions such as his order at the end of the Battle of Agincourt to massacre the prisoners, the French prisoners, or many of the French prisoners that had been taken by the English at that point. He's been criticized also for the scale and scope of his ambition and military achievement, which left a legacy of extraordinary complexity, and maybe an impossible legacy to his successors, you know, his brothers who and relatives who ran the show in England and France after he died, and then subsequently his son Henry VI, when he became an adult king, having to deal with the dual kingdom of England and France was very problematic and arguably led to the Wars of the Roses in England. So though he's criticised as a sort of callous, cold, cruel, not very nice person, a warmonger, um, often I feel that he's criticised for being a medieval king by people who just don't like the thought of that job. And one of my aims in writing this biography, which I was fairly sure as I started writing was going to be a positive biography, not rather than a hatchet job on Henry V, was to remind readers exactly what being King of England in the 15th century was thought to be about, and to slightly readjust this sense that anybody who wouldn't be a good candidate for the Democratic candidacy for the presidency of the modern United States, that's not the same set of criteria as being a good medieval king. So that was one of my aims, not the
Well,
only one.
well, I suppose if you are looking at it, judging him by today's standards, his childhood, I mean, it's traumatic. His mother dies, I suppose, when he's very young, and he's thrown into, well, he's not necessarily commanding boy, he's in senior positions in armies at a young age. So it's not as though, he can rely on a nice, comfortable, happy, settled family life.
Yes, there are certain things that happen to Henry V when he is a young man, a teenager, as we'd now describe it, that would certainly have had him taken away by social services in the 21st century. You know, he loses his mother when he's young, but of course in the Middle Ages that's not wildly uncommon. Once his father has fallen foul, Henry Bolingbroke is his father. When Henry Bolingbroke falls foul of Henry Bolingbroke's cousin, the king, Richard II, in 1398, the young to be Henry V is taken with Richard II off to Ireland on campaign and then locked in a castle once news of his father's invasion of England breaks in 1399. From the age of about 13, he's dragged around on military campaigns, and then sent to Wales to deal with uh, the the insurrection led by Owain Glyndwr. He's um, he's leading a third part of his father's army at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403 when he's grievously and nearly mortally injured by an arrow shot from a longbow. All of this, he survives a 30-day operation to save his life. All of this takes place before he's 17 years old. It's a hard upbringing, even by the standards of the early 15th century. Um, he's forged in fire. Yes.
Well, when you open the book with that, with the wound and the doctor, I forget his name actually.
John Bradmore is the name of the surgeon who operates on Henry. He's he's one of Henry IV's go-to doctors, surgeons.
I find this particularly fascinating. I've just been on YouTube watching a recreation of the wound and a dramatization of the operation to remove the arrowhead.
Yes.
It's and that's a nasty. You don't want that in your cheek.
No, it's a serious operation. So at the Battle of Shrewsbury, 1403, Henry is, as I've said, struck in the face with an arrow, and the arrowhead lodges in his skull, at the back of his skull, about 6 inches deep. And the notes, John Bradmore, the surgeon, is summoned to Kenilworth after the battle to try and save Henry's life because it's a miracle. It's a miracle already. I use a small m miracle, if you see what I mean. That he hasn't been killed, but it seems very likely he will die soon if this thing isn't removed, and it seems almost as likely that attempting to remove it will kill him. But they've got to try. So Bradmore comes along, and Bradmore is a really, really good doctor. He's performed operations like cauterizing an artery in a carpenter's arm after the carpenter slipped with a chisel and opened up an artery. He's able to perform that kind of really technical, difficult surgery. He saved the life of one of Henry IV's pavilion masters who'd attempted suicide by running into a wall with a dagger at his stomach. So he's able to deal with intestines, that kind of surgery where there's a high danger of blood poisoning. He performs plastic surgery, so he deals with eyelid bags, blepharoplasty. He's invented sort of all sorts of potions for healing wounds and keeping them clean. He understands the principles of antisepsis. So he's a very, very, very good surgeon. But even by his standards, this is a difficult operation. He has to keep the wound in Henry's face clean. He has to open it wide. He has to devise an entirely new surgical tool to get a hold of this arrowhead that's lodged in Henry's skull. He has to withdraw it with an incredibly steady hand so as not to rupture any blood vessels or damage any nerves. Then he has to close the wound up, keep it clean again, keep it uninfected, sew it up, and all the while trying to make sure that Henry doesn't go into toxic shock, into spasm. I mean, this is an extraordinarily complicated operation. It would be a complicated operation today. And it's done with the technology and medical knowledge of the early 15th century. So that's the operation, if you like, from Bradmore's perspective. And we know about this because Bradmore keeps detailed notes, which have been translated by the brilliant military historian Michael Livingston. We know much less about this, or we're by definition more speculative about the operation from Henry's perspective. What does this mean for a young Henry V, age 16? He doesn't keep a diary or notes of any sort, so we have to sort of derive from his later actions what this might possibly have meant to him. We can speculate with some degree of confidence that this would have hurt a lot and would have required a high degree of physical fortitude, tolerance for pain, tolerance for boredom and inaction. We can speculate that on the basis that Henry then goes, after he's recovered from the surgery, on a tour of religious shrines around England, that he subsequently becomes extremely devout and pious, or certainly demonstrates great devoutness and piety, that he ascribes his salvation to God's intervention. I think that's a wild leap of deduction. And we could, with a bit more of a wild leap of deduction, I think, and I would follow Michael Livingston, who also argues this, that we see in Henry's later actions as both prince and king a sense that he is acting as if he's been saved for a reason, that he has come to understand that God wants him to do something with his life, and it is for that reason that he's survived. Um, there's no way of proving that, but Henry is certainly a man with an extraordinary degree of focus, determination, self-belief, and stated belief that he is God's instrument to perform a certain task. And writing a biography, one is always engaging in psychological speculation to some degree. Um, I think a lot of that could be traced back to his experiences at 16 years old in Shrewsbury.
I've just detected you mentioned he displays piety, but does that mean then you think because this piety reputation he has, I mean, that's follows him through to the end of his life, and he's known as being very pious. Do you think then it's more for show than I mean,
No,
I,
no, I
I
don't
always
think
thought
that's
he
all.
genuinely, yeah,
Yeah, so I don't mean he performs piety in the sense that this is a part of a rigmarole. I think that, but
right,
there is a an interesting relationship between. I think he's sincerely devout, just as his father is, and he becomes more devout, just as his father does. Henry IV, as his life goes on, as he's crippled by illness, various degrees of illnesses from about 1405-6 onwards as he this is Henry IV, as he labors under his own reflections on the possible, crime of usurping the throne, he becomes more and more and more and more pious, outwardly pious and inwardly pious. Henry V takes a similar journey. It's a journey towards piety. I don't think any of it is at all cynical in Henry V's case. I think he's at moments of crisis he turns to friars, to hermits. He has a constant chaplain, a body of chaplains around him at court. He writes religious music. He is conventionally devout. He is prepared to burn or sanction the burning to death and simultaneous hanging of one of his best friends or former best friends, John Oldcastle, the Lollard leader. I don't think we can ever say that he's performing piety. However, he is also performing piety in a sense because although this is a sincere religious belief, he has a great and deep understanding of how to project, and I think a lot of that is learned from Richard II. I think Henry grows up as a young man under Richard II, who is not good at being a king, but except in one regard, and that is outward display. Henry V, although temperamentally very different and with a far deeper and better understanding of kingship than Richard II, is I think learns from Richard how to display kingship, and in his case, he displays it through public performances of piety. So, at his coronation, observers of the coronation, many of them mention that he seems to sort of pull down this mask in front of his face on the day of his coronation and sit sort of very somber, very severe, very stern, and to from that day forth become really, really intensely devout, such that a French spy records that he seems more like a monk than a king. Um, After Agincourt, when Henry comes home to London, there are great triumphs through the streets of London, parades. He is explicit that no matter how much people want to celebrate, and it's right for them to celebrate, and that he will be the focus of those celebrations, none of the glory is to be understood to be coming to him, but only through him as a conduit to God. I think Henry probably believes this, but I think he also compartmentalizes to the degree that he can deploy this belief as a tool of of political spectacle, and he's just he's a very, very, very clever politician who understands how to project his core beliefs in a political and spectacular way to his people. And I think that's part of why he's such an effective medieval king. it's also a reason, and in this sense, I agree with his modern critics, why you would probably not want him to be your ruler today.
Yeah, but it's interesting listening to that because, yes, we know about his generalship, we know about his piety, but there's that clever political communication, I suppose, that you've just been describing that is, I don't think I'd appreciated.
I think it is underappreciated with Henry, because such a large part of being a late medieval king rested on your success and to a degree your luck as a general. It's easy to overlook everything else, but if you really read a lot and study a lot of late medieval history, you realize that there are two these two key functions. One is the fighting, but the other is bringing your country along with you, and that's the provision of justice. That's managing parliaments. That's fostering good personal relations with your magnates, both spiritual and lay. It's about communicating through public spectacle and through letters and through personal relations with the people of London and the major towns. Because if you don't do any of that side of the job, it becomes very hard to do the other side. Edward III, Henry V's great grandfather, had been a master of this. He'd really understood this very, very well, and Henry V owes an enormous amount in his kingship to Edward III. Edward III understood that if he wanted to go and pursue his vision of claiming the crown of France as well as England, or at least of using that as an excuse to nail down problems he had in the southwest of France and Gascony, then he had to, by definition, have a good relationship with his country because they were the ones who were going to pay for it. You can't raise tax in late medieval England without negotiation, without personal negotiation with your magnates, and without sort of representative negotiation with your people through the commons in Parliament. But if you get that right, you are allowed an enormous amount of leeway to make mistakes, to ask for more money when war becomes more expensive than you thought it was going to be, which it always does. So Henry and Edward III are the best at this in all of Plantagenet history. They go to parliaments, they listen, they respond, they react, they are proactive about reforming their country, remedying grievance, and then the country is happy to support them in their ambitions and aims overseas. And it's a calculus. It sounds simple, and it is simple, but as I said already, it's simple but not easy.
Well, fighting overseas seems. I mean, that's the advice given by Henry IV, isn't it, to Henry as a young boy or young man to fight abroad. I mean, Henry IV, the relationship between the two is obviously we're all taught Henry V at school, probably.
Mm.
And that relationship between the two, it's not an easy one. I was just reading, it was very interesting reading about I think it's where he's having trouble. Henry is having trouble in Wales, and his father, he comes before his father, and his father, I think he's short with him, not doesn't put his arm around his shoulder and don't worry about it. We'll get through this together. It's very much this is you're dealing with this and you need to deal with it. That
Yes, no, you're right. That's so when he's still a teenager, Henry to be Henry V, Henry of Prince of Wales, is sent to Wales because Owen Glendower has claimed that he's Prince of Wales. So Henry IV delegates the task to his son, supported by an able set of more senior and experienced nobles, but he sends him there as a training ground and as an object lesson in how to defend what's yours. It's part of a bigger Lancastrian project. I mean, Henry IV has four sons. He has Henry as Thomas, to be Duke of Clarence, John to be Duke of Bedford, and Humphrey to be Duke of Gloucester. And the eldest three are given their own bits to look after and places to learn. So Henry goes to Wales, Thomas goes to Ireland, John goes to Northern England, sort of Scottish borders. And so it's hands-on training. But Henry IV there is a degree of tough love. And when Conwy Castle is lost to rebels, Henry IV writes to his son, Prince Henry, and says, since this was lost on your watch, you're going to have to go and get it back. And that's the lesson. He's very prepared to support his son if he sees his son is doing the right thing, and he's prepared to step in if he sees that things are getting too difficult. Um, but he's not going to soft soap and say, "Oh, what they took the castle and those naughty Welsh, never mind." It's like if you lost it, you go get it back. It's the dad saying, there's a bully took your lunch in school. Okay, tomorrow you walk in and you just punch him in the face as soon as you see him." And young Henry,
How
takes
old
this
is he
on
at this
board.
stage?
This is, he's sort of 14 years old. Um, so there's a great letter when he's about 15 years old where you can see that this advice is sinking in. And he writes in French, and this letter's in French, unlike his later letters as king, which would often be in English. But he writes to his father and he says, "Okay, so you told me to go sort out Glendower. Well, Glendower had been putting it around that he was up for a fight, he was going to take me down, blah, blah, blah." I'm paraphrasing here. Uh, so, you know what? I took some men and I went round his house. I literally went round to Owen Glendower's house and I was like, okay, let's have a fight. But he wasn't in. So I burned his house down and I killed as many people as I possibly could. And then we went to his other house and he wasn't there either. And some guy said, oh, please spare my life. I'll give you however much money it was. So I cut his head off. And then I came home. Lots of love. Hope you're well, Henry. And so this advice has, definitely sinks in. And you see this sort of gleeful, almost sort of buoyant enthusiasm for warfare on the part of the young Henry. Perfect if you're going to be a late medieval king. That you need that. As Richard II's reign had proved, you can't be king without that. It just doesn't work. You need not to be totally reckless, but you do have to have a sort of energetic, aggressive approach to warfare. That is the way of this world.
That's such a window into what life was like as a young royal growing up. I mean, it's it's not there's not much laughs and japes to be had, really, are there?
I think there are laughs and japes to be had. Um, I think well, we get fewer glimpses of them in the political history than we might. One of the things I've tried to do in this new biography of Henry uh, is to try and put back into the story some of the what is he like when he's not fighting, his hinterland. And we see a lot of that in his childhood when he's growing up in his mother's house. It's a house full of music and of art and of literature and of animals and of gifts constantly arriving from Bolingbroke, who's been traveling, and of nice things to eat and of lovely, there is a sort of color and of new clothes, new outfits for the summer and winter, and night lights to read, when it's dark. And we see some of that carry through into Henry's later life, even when he goes on campaign in France after Agincourt. And these are really hard campaigns. There are no more big battles after Agincourt. It's siege after siege after siege after siege. Um, and he's taking big piles of books with him when he goes. He's reading Arthurian legends, and it always strikes me as this is like the equivalent of taking a big stack of comic books, sort of like Spider-Man and Batman away with you. If you're taking the Arthurian Chronicles, he takes towards the end of his life, when he's in his early 30s, so I'm sure he doesn't imagine it's towards the end of his life, he's taking chronicles of the Crusades and of the First Crusade, and he's becoming really interested in crusading history and starting to imagine that once he's done with France, he's going to go off and rebuild, as he says on his deathbed, rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. This is the scale of his ambition, and it's drawn from his reading. He's a great lover of music. He composes music. His accounts show records for his harps being restrung, for new cases for his harps when he goes traveling again on campaign. When he marries Catherine de Valois in 1420, the daughter of the French King Charles VI, and she's having to live in the field with him because he's always on campaign. He makes sure that he has a special house built for her a few miles away from the front line, and every morning he sends musicians to her to play. So there are, there is this. He has this hinterland that is artistic, that's literary, that's musical, that's about stories. Um, we had he lived longer, perhaps we would see more of this. We'd certainly see it in his brothers John and definitely his brother Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. I mean, patron of the part of the Bodleian Library in Oxford, this great collector of books, this great patron of artists. It's that's what the family is like, and so I think it's important to try and restore some of that. It's not a case of saying, ah, well, forgive him being a warmonger because he could read. It's that's like saying, ah, yes, but Hitler was a great lover of cinema and dogs. It doesn't work. It's not. It's not a sort of. We're not balancing these things morally in a scales, but we are saying there. His. Let's try and see the man a little more in the round.
Well, when I know that this comparison's been made often before, but there are so many parallels with Alexander the Great. And
Hmm.
having studied ancient history, and particularly Alexander, I'd kind of always sort of scoffed at the mere idea that an English king could compete with Alexander. But there are so many. He has a difficult relationship with his father. He becomes king at a young age. He's blooded at a young age. He experiences a serious wound. He dies young, and he wins many battles. So,
Yes.
and then at his death, the everything falls apart, just like with
Hmm.
Alexander as well.
Yes.
Um, but is that too tempting, or is he genuinely the English Alexander?
Well, insofar as England's going to have had an Alexander,
Smaller
or
scale.
let alone even a Napoleon, yes, you have the closest thing that the Plantagenet dynasty, with maybe the exception of Richard the Lionheart, a difficult relationship with his father, you know, but yes, it's perfectly fine to make those kind of parallels, and I think that
Really, you don't sound like you think it is.
no, I think it is. Oh,
Yeah.
I think that we get historians are often very wary about doing this sort of thing, and but why should we be? I mean, all we're doing is discussing the past.
Hmm.
Yes, I mean, insofar as the Plantagenet dynasty ever creates someone who conquers at scale, yes, this is your English Alexander. There is no other candidate who comes close. I mean, if the stated objective in the second half of Plantagenet history of all the kings is, and this runs through to the Tudor period as well, is I am going to be the king of France. Well, everyone walks the walk, but only one person. No, everyone talks the
Everyone
talk, but only
talks.
one
Yeah.
person walks the walk, right? Um, he goes out there and does it. And Edward III had won a lot, but if the scale of the settlement um, after Crécy, after Calais, after Poitiers, when they make the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, it's a remarkable achievement, but it comes nowhere close to what Henry achieves under the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. This is a different order of conquest. He literally takes the French crown, and that's the one thing they all said they were going to do, and no one ever did. Well, Henry did it. So in military terms, there's no one higher, and of course this happens while he's a young man. He burns extremely brightly, and then all of a sudden he's not there anymore, and everybody has to deal the um, with the legacy, with the consequences of his astonishing achievements, and that proves very difficult because they only made one Henry V. They nearly made another one in John Duke of Bedford. I mean, John Duke of Bedford is a very underrated character in English history. This is Henry's third brother. There's Henry, Thomas, John, Humphrey. Um, John is the man who carries the can in France after his brother dies, and performs heroics. Battle of Verneuil in 1424. He holds the fort. He really makes the notional prospect of the English kingdom in northern France a reality. And he sort of has Henry VI crowned. I mean, it's not in Rouen, it's in Paris. It's nearly the same thing. So, um, but even he is not Henry V. There's only one.
No. Well, I suppose dying young wasn't part of the plan. And was there anything then? I mean, he had an heir, but an heir who was, well, deficient ultimately.
Hmm.
There really wasn't much Henry could have done, I suppose. He couldn't if he had known he was going to die. Stupid question, I know. There wasn't really much he could have done to change the.
Yeah, yeah. So the easy criticism is, well, he's just lucky that he dies young because he's really gone way aimed way too high. It was stupid to be involved in this kind of war, and you just see what happens. He checks out, and everything looks glorious, but then it's a total nightmare. Everything he leaves. Okay, that's true up to a point. The Treaty of Troyes, astonishing as it is in 1420, comes with very, very big problems, which are immediately recognised by everybody. Which is, well, hold on, this was a war of conquest to win back what was ours slash yours. This is the English Parliament's view. But now you've made a treaty where you are the heir and regent to the Crown of France. So the war isn't over. You've got to keep fighting, but really, this is now a war that's changed character completely. Because what is Henry fighting for in France after 1420, after he's made this treaty? He is at one belligerent in a French civil war, and an English Parliament has no interest in paying to finance a French civil war. They've reached the limits of what they're prepared to do, and now the challenge is, okay, how does Henry actually make one king, two kingdoms that they not to be united? How does he make that a reality? Had he lived a little longer, I suspect the answer would have been a sort of federation with himself as a kind of emperor figure, probably John Duke of Bedford running France, probably Humphrey running England, just as happened after he died, except, with himself on the top, maybe going off on crusade to Jerusalem. But he dies, and so he goes out in this sort of blaze of glory. It's not enough to say yes, but then it was all very difficult for everybody, so he should never have done it. You're supposed to do this? Every English king, bar Richard II, had made it a stated objective of their policy to go and smash the French and to claim you're doing this because you want to be the king of France. Not to do that had been proven disastrous by Richard II. It had been an absolute and total failure of policy by Richard II not to go and do this thing. So the aim is not in question at the time. The achievements, well, if that's the aim, you can't really blame him for being so good he actually manages to do it. Perhaps the problem with him dying when he does is that nobody can get out. The problem with him dying when he does is the minority of his son. Because his son is so young, less than a year old, this is the future Henry VI when he dies, you automatically have a minority of 18 years. In that, and you can't, you could level the criticism of Henry V. Well, he should have married earlier then. His father had him when he was still a teenager. Yes, but Henry couldn't marry earlier because his marriage was being reserved as part of this French policy. He wanted to marry a daughter of the King of France. He could only do that in 1420. So his marriage has to be delayed. So he has a son as soon as he humanly can. The problem is he dies when his son is so young. And for the sort of 17 years of Henry VI's minority, nobody can do anything substantial in terms of reaching a settlement in France. Had Henry lived maybe 1 year longer, we're not talking 15 years longer, 1 year longer, it may be that he could have settled in France, and that settlement might have been a partition along the River Loire, the Kingdom of Bourges in the south, which run by the Dauphin, the future Charles VII, an Anglo-Burgundian realm in the north, and a definitive settlement could have been reached. But because he didn't, nobody could negotiate that for 17 years, because anyone who did could be accused of lèse-majesté, and that would be fatal for anybody who tried to do it. You'd be encroaching the power of the King of England during his minority. So that's the big problem. Is the length of minority of his successor. So what do you do? I mean, yes, it's in some senses, Henry V is certainly at the root of the Wars of the Roses, which ensue because of the disastrous trouble Henry VI, his regents, and then himself have with managing the scale of his father's achievement. But it's not enough for that to be true, to say that he should never have tried. If he hadn't tried, things would have been much worse.
It was so ingrained with Henry V. And I know I've mentioned the Shakespeare play before, but the truth in that is that it's the victory over France at Agincourt. And I'm purposefully not going to make you talk about the battle itself, just because it's been done to death everywhere. And I'm sure there are millions, quite literally, of podcasts talking about the battle. But do you think that Henry V, whilst obviously, it's just a wonderful play and it's hugely inspiring for many, do you think then that the that Shakespeare really does get in the way of Henry's military prowess, because it's based all around his wonderful speeches, and you don't get to see really some of the reforms he carried out with the army, and and his maneuvering in the campaign.
Yeah, one would never wish away Shakespeare, right?
No.
But the issue for 15th century historians, and it gets worse as the 15th century goes on, is you're always looking through the lens of Shakespeare. It's so hard to shift the ideas of this time that come from those, you know, generally overall brilliant plays. Plays of differing quality, but brilliant plays. And Henry V is a great example of this. I mean, Henry as presented from Prince Hal in the Henry IV plays through to the King in Henry V is a distortion, particularly the Prince Hal stuff, which is it's brilliant dramatically, but it doesn't really fit with anything we know, with the majority of what we know about Henry as a young man. The presentation of Agincourt as a sort of a victory of rhetoric in a way. Also, yes, of course, detracts from the reality of that peculiar campaign. We never totally get the sense that this was all a gigantic blunder, and or at best a roll of the dice that somehow just comes off. But that's sort of to judge Shakespeare on those grounds is to make a big category error, isn't it? I mean, Shakespeare takes this story and turns it into brilliant, rousing drama, just in the same way that Ridley Scott took a sort of story about the imperial Rome and made Gladiator a sort of brilliant, rousing piece of cinema that, as I've heard Russell Crowe say more than once, right now somewhere in the world someone is watching Gladiator. It's but even with regard to the speeches, some of what Shakespeare puts into Henry's mouth in the play is you can see where he's got it from. You can trace his sources, and Henry allegedly really does say, I wouldn't have, someone says, oh God, I wish we had more men. Henry, the real Henry, turns around and goes, I wouldn't have a single one more. Don't talk stupid. I mean, he basically. So you can trace Shakespeare back through Holinshed Hall to the original sources, just as you can in Richard II, when, in the play Richard II, Shakespeare has Richard flopping on the ground. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. You can trace that back, if you want, through the Chronicles to Adam Usk having dinner with Richard, him basically saying the same thing. And there are other parts where this is just sort of Shakespeare being brilliant Shakespeare. On the eve of Agincourt, Henry, and just before Agincourt, probably the real Henry gives a number of different speeches of different quality and different style according to who he's addressing, which bit of his army he's addressing. It's just not plausible he can stand in front of the entire army and address them as one. I think that's why you have in the sources of the real Agincourt so many different versions of what he actually said. My favourite of them, I don't think this makes it the only one or the true one. I think it's just one of the things somebody reported he said when he was geeing up a particular bit of the army, was nothing more sort of eloquent or elaborate than "Fellas, let's go." Now that's the opposite of the sort of Shakespearean high-flown rhetoric, but that gets to a certain bit of Henry pretty well. He loved the word "fellas." He was always using it, and he was always sort of imperative and urgent and impatient with his instructions, and he
Did
didn't
his
often.
fellas love him? But like like I'm mentioning Alexander again, his men loved him. Did Henry's men love him?
Well, they followed him. Sometimes they moaned about it. It was a great letter. It's just after the siege of Rouen, I think. Somebody writing home just quite grumpy about this whole thing. I'm tired of this unlusty soldier's life. Just soldiers in the field, fed up. Um, they followed him. They got paid. He made sure that on a sort of boring but essential practical level, he did things such as um, for in the case of soldiers who'd gone out and fought for him and been killed, he made sure that their families were paid out the full value of their contracts rather than just the contract the day that soldier was known to have died, which sounds like a small thing, but it's everything really to a veteran's family. And Henry has the sensitivity to understand that a small thing like that is likely to make recruitment for the next round of war far easier. That being said, I mean we don't have tons of soldiers' diaries, so it's not as easy as sort of assessing the state of morale of troops in the trenches in World War One. You can see that as Henry's short reign goes on, it becomes increasingly difficult to find anyone who wants to go out to France. It's war weariness. They may be winning, but it's there's still it's still not an easy life out there. That particularly because this is siegecraft and the disease. There's a lot of disease whips around. It eventually gets to Henry himself, right? So it's hard to assess morale, but you can see from Henry's actions that he does everything he can to keep morale high, and he's constantly touring his sort of siege positions every single day. He's out there adjusting things, talking to people. He's seen among the men. So this idea of sort of Henry, friend of the common soldier, I think you're romanticizing things slightly, but there is some basis in reality for it.
Well, Dan, this has been wonderful. I've greatly enjoyed listening to you talking about Henry V. I suppose we can end it with one last question, which is Henry your favorite king of, and I'm talking all of them. No, I can't allow you to just talk about the medieval period.
He's my favorite right now for sure.
Hmm.
I'm very fond of Richard II because I said earlier on that I like
Richard II.
well, I think the kings who get it, I think people who get their job completely right or completely wrong are interesting. And so Richard II I find interesting as well. Um, and now I feel like you're compelling me to stray outside the Middle Ages just to prove that I can do so.
I always like George IV because he seems like he may have been disastrous, but he had a wonderful time.
Yes, it does seem like he had rather a lot of fun, doesn't it? Well, I think I'm sort of straying mentally closer and closer to the present day, and ending up in the sort of early.
You can
Uh,
say Elizabeth II if
I'm
you
not
want.
gonna, no, no, I'm not saying Elizabeth II, but I'm thinking Edward the Seventh, I suppose.
Oh, right.
Right, like a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah. He's sort of the George IV of the
Yeah, just
20th
sort of
century.
rolling around, smoking cigars,
Yeah, having lots of affairs. Yeah.
enjoying afternoon tea in a sort of in Japanese costume with someone else's wife.
Yes.
It's like that's a great twist on being king. That's not Henry V.
No, certainly not. Certainly not.
But it always strikes me that he enjoyed himself. But they both enjoyed themselves, in their different ways. I suppose it's just what is your idea of fun?
Well, Henry must have enjoyed campaigning.
Must I
It
mean
was in his
he
bones.
clearly got a kick out of it, unable to resist all of these moments where he could have gone, you know what, actually that I'm gonna I've you're in the casino, it's late at night. I'm going to go cash my chips. You know what? Because I'm going to quit while I'm winning. He never quits. He never stops. And this injunction on his tomb, this inscription, although not, from him, is still so suitable. Flee idleness. That's him. Flee idleness. Never stop.
Well, it's been fantastic. Thanks,
Ah,
Dan.
no, I've had a wonderful time talking to you, Ollie. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening. As I mentioned at the start, plenty more great history is on the way. So please do subscribe, rate, follow, and share. But until then, thank you and good night.